I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Parkinson. He's at Binghamton University, and there's an error in your program. It says he's associate professor. I just found out he's now full professor, so that's wonderful. And I want to draw attention. He's got great books out, including the topic of today's talk, 13 Clocks, and its predecessor, The Common Cause. But he's got a new one coming out in May called Heart of American Darkness, Bewilderment and Horror on the Frontier, American Frontier? Early American Frontier, which is a fabulous title and looks really great. So that's going to be coming out in May, so keep an eye out for that in your local bookshop because I think it's going to be a great addition to the topic today. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Robert Parkinson.
Thank you, Jacob. And I have done a number of these talks, but none as professional and just really fantastically organized and thoughtful as this one has been. So I very appreciate it. This is my first time being in Minnesota. So, hey. And I am, well, my students would say, aggressively loud. If you read some of my student evaluations, they're sort of like, oh, God. But, and I've been told if I stay on the wood, I'm fine. So I said I don't necessarily need the microphone, but I have been known to walk up and down the aisles, but I'm supposed to stay on the wood. So I'll stay on the wood. I will follow directions. Okay, so thank you to the Minnesota History Center and especially Dr. Roram for bringing me here. I'm very flattered. I teach in upstate New York, so I know snow, but I am glad to have missed it this weekend. So thank you guys also for coming out on Easter weekend as well. I very much appreciate your coming to hear me ramble on a bit about some of the challenges and problems that the colonists and colonial leadership faced at the moment that they felt like the crisis was of the 1770s was approaching a point of no return. So I want to talk about that a little bit today. So we'll start with this guy. All right, now, this is John Adams in his 80s. This is John Adams speaking in his 80s. Remember this because we're going to go back and I'm going to show you John Adams in his 30s, a painting of him, and he's not going to look like he looks now. He's going to look sort of sly. So this is what John Adams wrote. As the founding generation started to get to an advanced age, people wanted to know, before they were gone, what they thought about how this came about. So a Baltimore newspaper publisher named Hezekiah Niles wrote to John Adams, and he wrote to some other leaders of the founding, and said, hey, could you tell me what your take is on this? And so John Adams, who had been thinking about this a lot, in his elderly years, wrote this letter in 1818. So he's in his early 80s when he writes this letter. And he says to Niles, the colonies had grown up under constitutions of government so different. There was so great a variety of religions. They were composed of so many different nations. Their customs, manners, and habits had so little resemblance, and their intercourse had been so rare, and their knowledge of each other so imperfect, that to unite them in the same principles and theories and the same system of action was certainly a very difficult enterprise. The complete accomplishment of it in so short a time and by such simple means was perhaps a singular example in the history of mankind. I mean, this is him saying, weren't we awesome? 13 clocks were made to strike together a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before affected. And when we start thinking about things like artists arranging things for the Enlightenment generation, they're sort of touching on things that they think that God might have done. So this is saying, boy, me and my pals were miracle workers. So it is sort of a pat on the back, but it is important to think about. John Adams is going to, this is the first time he's used the word 13 clocks. He uses it about 10 days before the Declaration of Independence. Again, he's going to say something very different then. But this is what he writes in 1818. 13 clocks were made to strike together, a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before effected. And so this is the problem that I've been working on I was just in the front row texting with my daughters who are now just graduated from college, and one is about to graduate from college, and they were born when I started working on this project. So yes, yes, yes. One was born the weekend that my dissertation was proposed or started, and so they've grown up with this as well. So I've been thinking about these things for a very, very long time, and this always fascinated me about the problems of the founding, because this American Revolution, to me, makes very, very little sense. This, on the face of it, there isn't the kind of tyranny or the kind of, it's all anticipated tyranny, the things that might happen in the future. If they disregard these laws, or they do these things, down the road, we might see real problems coming. Americans aren't really great at anticipating problems and getting ahead of them. Usually they have to reach a crisis before we say, oh, maybe we should put something in front of that bridge support before a ship runs into it, or those kinds of things. We are usually more reactive than proactive, but for these guys, they were thinking very proactively. And the social conditions really aren't there like we see in France or Russia or Haiti or China or other places that have significant revolutions like this. So it's always been a puzzle to me, a fascinating puzzle that's occupied the better part of my life. I think in terms of how questions. There are ways to approach history, and they're not unrelated, how questions and why questions, but I'm a process thinker. I like to think in terms of how questions. How did things happen? How did the colonies unite? As opposed to why they did, although again, those are not exactly unrelated to one another. So I want to talk today about how questions. How did this happen? Adam says it was a miracle. And no artist had ever thought about it. He doesn't exactly tell you why, although later in the letter I'm going to go back to this. And he's going to sort of give you some hints as to how he thinks this happened. So I want to talk today about some how questions. And the how questions open up a big can of worms. Because in the 5 years before the shooting starts at Lexington and Concord, if you were to go to Las Vegas and put all of your money on betting against the 13 colonies would work together, the odds that Las Vegas would say, no bet. No way. We're never taking that bet. It is such a sure and foregone conclusion that there's no way these guys could think and operate and work together, just like Adam says. It's a miracle. And those odds are getting longer and longer and longer in the first half of the 1770s. So I'm going to start with talking about 5 problems of the 1770s that make this even more of a miracle than Adams wants to even is remembering. So there's 5 problems. 1, and this is, of course, this is Franklin. Franklin draws this in the 1750s, anticipating in a generation before they really need the snake to join together, and so. Right before, and I mean right before, they have to declare independence. For the most part, if you asked anybody in the continent, join or die, they would say or die. Or die. Definitely or die. No way we're joining. That snake is just fine as it is. We like it like this. Join or die. So the or die is getting to be stronger in the first half of the 1770s. What does Adam say in that letter? What are all the things that are separating them? Religion, customs, habit, manners, intercourse. He's right. There is tremendous amounts of disagreement. When John Adams gets to the First Continental Congress, a group of Quakers in Philadelphia pull him aside and say, hey, we haven't forgotten that you guys in Massachusetts hanged a number of Quakers in the 17th century. If we join up with you, are you going to do that again? Are we allowed to be in the same things? Your Puritan ancestors were kind of huge jerks to us, and they executed some of us for coming to Massachusetts. So what's going to happen here? Religions are driving people apart. Their customs, their habits, their manners, their intercourse, and by that he means economics, are all very diverse. There's not a lot of entanglements between the 13 colonies. If you think about it, there's much more kind of connection to England or to the continent of Europe than there is to one another, for the most part. And I'm going to talk a lot about newspapers, but if you were to read a newspaper in 1772 or 3 or 4, you would read a lot of news about Europe, what the royal families all over the place are doing, or who's perhaps on the verge of war with one another, or even what the weather is like in St. Petersburg or Bilbao or Paris or certainly or Rome, but not about what's going on if you're in Philadelphia, about what's going on in Boston or going on in New York. There's not a lot of information. The foreign news desk is much more important than the domestic stuff. So they don't know a lot about each other. And what they do know, they don't like about each other. There are significant regions where there is somewhere between a simmering civil war and a hot fighting civil war all over the place. That you have in North Carolina, you have this one. Nope, go back, you turkey. Go back, there we go. That's the button. There is a fight between North Carolinians are fighting each other with cannons in 1771. There is, this whole region is claimed by both Pennsylvania and Virginia. That's going to turn into a significant war. That's what my book coming out in May is mostly about. That's a good one. You have all sorts of fighting going on here. This is an area that's called the Yankee-Pennamite War. It's the Wyoming Valley, Connecticut says that's their charter. So Pennsylvania is besieged in 2 different locations in the 1770s of people who are trying to pick off their territory. You've heard of Ethan Allen. That's the Vermont territory. New York and New Hampshire are fighting one another about who's going to get that territory. There are all sorts of internal problems and disputes that are driving one another away from one another. Some of those guys are going to, like Ethan Allen, is going to become a patriot, but they don't know that. They don't know that. And in fact, they often pick the wrong sides. When the news of the Battle of Alamance reaches Boston, they pick the side of the regulators in North Carolina. And guess what a number of the regulators are going to be once the shooting starts in the Revolution? Loyalists. And they hold up the regulators as kind of a vanguard of fighting against British tyranny. But most of those guys are going to actually work against them in the Revolution. So we don't know how the chips are going to fall, and they don't know how the chips are going to fall in the 1770s. So that's problem number 2. Problem number 3, slavery. Slavery's a tough one. Some people see the growing imperial crisis of the 1760s and 70s with Britain as a potential threat to slavery, and they don't like it. That's one of the things that's driving them away from Britain. The 1770s is the greatest decade so far of the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, the capacity is growing and growing and growing. And the 1770s sees the highest percentage of African American population as a total of the whole until the 1860s, until the Civil War. So there are more African American people in what becomes the U.S. in that decade than there will be again until the 1860s. And then in 1772, Britain has a very famous and very celebrated court case that is the anti-Dred Scott case. That's exactly what it is. Somerset versus Stewart. James Somerset is an enslaved person from Virginia, and his master takes him to England. And he sues, and when he tries to take him away from there, because he's still his slave, Somerset sues and says, you can't take me away from here, because once I got to Britain, I became free, which is exactly the Missouri-Illinois problem in the Dred Scott case. And in this case, the British High Court, Lord Mansfield, says, yep, you're right, you're free. And, and the reason for that is because there is no positive law or slave code in Britain. That's what the argument of the case is. There's no slave code in Britain. There's no positive law. It's all just custom, and so it doesn't exist here. So the idea that slavery doesn't exist in Britain is established with this case. But what does that mean for the empire? What does that mean in Jamaica and Antigua and Nevis and South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia? Don't know. Don't know. They're worried about it. There's talk about, the phrasing of this is, this judgment seems pregnant with consequences. Well, how pregnant are those consequences? That's a good question they don't know. What does this mean for the colonies? So people are starting to get nervous about it. This becomes a thing. Now, as I say, this is the 1770s. The Americans are getting drawn deeper and deeper and deeper into the slave trade. The British are getting drawn deeper and deeper into it. Right? These are the dots you see here are slave ships coming from Africa. The red ones are British. Okay, those are sailed under a British flag with a British captain. The size of the dot corresponds to the size of the ship. So you see in 1773, 1774, even more, and these are the ones that are coming to the mainland over the course of 1774. 1775, even more, and even bigger ships. All the red dots show you how much Liverpool, Bristol, London, Boston, Portsmouth, Newburyport are invested deeper and deeper into the slave trade. Even though it's going to the south, the New England colonies are deeper invested in it. 1776, look at all those dots. If we zoom in, look at all those dots. Right? I drew this from the marvelous transatlantic slave trade database. The website is slavevoyages.org, and you can investigate all these things. These come from all the records of these things. So you see all these red dots. These are all British ships. So the British Empire is getting more and more invested in it, but whether or not this is going to last and what threat this is, so that's one of the reasons to hope to maybe band together and declare independence, right? This becomes one of the arguments that you might have heard of in the 1619 Project. When one of the introductory essays of that project and book garnered a lot of criticism because the author said that this was the reason that Americans banded together to declare independence. Now, I find that to be not complicated enough of an answer. I think it is on the menu that this is one of the reasons why people started to become more resistant to the British Empire, because they were worried that because this increasing investment might look more and more shaky, that they need to take control of it themselves, right? So that assertion, this is a sort of a clarification for the New York Times from 2020. That assertion was sort of complicated, but that was, I think, the point of criticism. I don't disagree with it, but I think it is on the menu, and the menu is larger than just one item. Because, number 4, some people wanted to get rid of slavery. A lot of people wanted to get rid of slavery in the 1770s. It is becoming a thing that's tied more and more with some of these calls for liberty by African Americans who are filing freedom suits or saying, well, if you're talking about liberty, let's talk about liberty. Okay, you have when in the protests of the Stamp Act in Charleston, South Carolina, there are people who are holding signs and yelling in the streets saying liberty, liberty, and then a couple of weeks later, you have African Americans doing the same thing, and they go, whoa, that's not what we meant. But that kind of language is suffusing itself and questioning slavery. You had several colonies, including Virginia, passing laws banning the slave trade. Most of those were vetoed by the king. That's going to be in the Declaration of Independence. You have freedom suits. The First Continental Congress does include the Atlantic slave trade in their non-importation ban. So slavery is in the fall of 1774, ostensibly banned together. And Jefferson writes this in the summer of 1774. This pamphlet, the Summary View of the Rights of the British Americans, is what establishes his fame as a writer. Right? No one really knows who Thomas Jefferson is. He's 31 years old, and he's a Virginian, and he's a member of stuff. But this pamphlet is what makes makes him eligible to write the Declaration of Independence. This was people really cotton to this thing. And in that he says this: the abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire. Remember that. I bolded that for a reason. In these colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to include all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect these prohibitions by imposing duties, which might amount to a prohibition, has been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, vetoed by the king. The great object of desire, Jefferson writes in the summer of 1774. Abolition, the great object of desire, remember that. So there are people, so there's cross-cutting pressures here. So slavery is very, very complicated. People want to feel like they need to resist the king to defend it. Other people want to resist the king to get rid of it. And then finally, there's the loyalist counterargument. Now, if you know anything about the musical, Hamilton musical, unfortunately for people like Samuel Seabury, they're mostly there as a way to make Hamilton sound smart and cool. But that's actually really unfair to the loyalists, especially in the winter of 1774 and the few months before Lexington and Concord. Again, we know how this is going to turn out. They didn't. A number of patriot leaders, including John Adams, is going to get super worried about the loyalist counter-argument, and they don't know if it's going to have an effect that might ruin the 13 clocks working together. Because you see pamphlet after pamphlet. I mean, Adams himself, Mr. Miracle Worker, is so worried about the series called Massachusettensis, which needs a little better publicist for that name. That he starts writing anonymously a counter-argument under the name of Novanglis. Every single time one of these appears, he has a response, publication response. He's so worried that it's going to gain traction in Boston that we have to respond every single time. Worried, worried, worried. Don't know how it's going to turn out. These 5 problems are lengthening the odds about, and again, for 80-year-old Adams, making the miracle that much more miraculous, right? All right, so again, die. Die, die, die. Die, die, die. So what could be some glue here? If these are the things that they're driving these colonies away from one another, or making them suspicious of one another, or making their motives conflict with one another, what could be some glue? And this is why the revolution to me is so fascinating, because this is where things stand in the months and weeks before they have to do something together. So what could be some glue? All right, here we go. Now I said Adams has been thinking about this topic a lot, and he and Jefferson in their old age, when they make up from being bitter political enemies in the when they run for president in the 1790s, and they never speak again for a long time. When they do make nice with one another and have a rapprochement, they have an extensive, lovely correspondence with one another, and it often revolves around lots of different topics, but one of them is the memory and the establishing the history of the revolution. They are working on massaging, the two of them, massaging what people remember about the revolution. So Adams, when Hezekiah Niles comes to ask him, he's like, I'm ready for this question. I've been working on this for years with TJ. So this is what Adams says then. And again, still old man. Young men of letters in all the states should undertake the laborious but certainly interesting and amusing task of searching and collecting all the records, pamphlets, newspapers, and handbills of the 13 colonies to find out how the temper of views of the people had changed, right? So I, when my daughters were babies, became one of those young men, I don't know about young men of letters, but I became one of those young men who undertook the laborious and mostly interesting and sometimes amusing task of searching and collecting those records, especially the newspapers. So I read every newspaper we had at that time, over the course of the Revolutionary War. Now, that sounds like a pretty significant brag. I'll talk about what a colonial newspaper is like in the 1770s. It is 4 pages long. My wife, who is a 20th century historian and reads newspapers in New York City, really hates me for this because she's like, oh yeah, 4 pages once a week? Oh, you poor thing you. Right, so, yeah. Oh, no. Right, but we have them all because they wanted to keep all those things. So this is where they were produced. And as you can see here, just about all of them are basically tied to the Atlantic seaboard. Major newspapers had grown slowly over the 18th century, but rapidly in the 1760s and especially the 1770s. But they are still tied to economic commerce. They are oftentimes closer to the sort of the Wall Street Journal than they are to politics at that point. But that is changing. They're much more tied to commerce at first, and also to what's going on across the Atlantic Ocean. So this is where those happen. And you can see these tiny little nodes you would think would have very little to do with people who live here or here or here or here or here or all these places. But one of the things that I found is they do penetrate. Newspapers do penetrate. We have a subscription book of one of these newspapers. There's about 35 of them that are in publication at the time of the Revolution starts, in 1775. We have the subscription book of one newspaper, and I won't tell you how long I tried to. Well, it was a couple of years of trying to decipher what this book was, because the printers that made this, the business people that put this together, they didn't need to explain to historians later about like how the book was created, and so it took me years to figure out that it was organized by routes and organized in specific ways by writers and all sorts of stuff. But once I did, and this is the map that's in 13 Clocks that is my favorite map. You see where this one newspaper goes. It doesn't. About a third of its weekly subscriptions stay in the city of Philadelphia, but 2/3 of them go all over the place. And right deep into some of that territory that's in dispute, or at least getting close to it. You see these weird sort of. There's all sorts of mountains here, but that's the weird riders that go through here. But there's some and they go deep into the Shenandoah Valley. They go down into Williamsburg. And further south to South Carolina. And so this is one sort of web that I can illustrate to you. And there's 35 others that if we were to look at this, you could see sort of the skeins of these webs do spread out more than just staying in Philadelphia or Annapolis or Williamsburg or Boston or New York, right? So this is the chance to have some glue, and this is what the patriot leadership recognized and understood much, much better than either the Loyalists or the British. The power that this might have. All right, so this is a newspaper, and this is July 1776. This is the Virginia Gazette. Super, super attractive and interesting, right? Right? Yeah, you want to go blind. I spent about a year and a half or so reading all these things, right? So this is what it is, and also the construction of a newspaper in the colonial America is much more about ink and drying than it is about trying to get you to capture your attention. There's no headlines. The front page. This is the front page of the 4, typically, and this is the back page. This is where the back page are. These are the advertisements, right? Woo! Scintillating. Right? This is the back page. Now, what you would do is you would start, let's say the newspaper comes out on Mondays, right? It comes out once a week on Mondays, right? So to start next Monday's paper, you would start on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday putting together the front page and the back page because you got to let them dry. So you hang them up in ropes all over the roof of the print shop. And you got to let them dry because inside, in the middle 2 pages, is where you put the news. Okay, so this is stuff that you have already sort of established. You have advertisements here that might run for a few weeks at a time. You know what those are. You can start that process early in the week. And while apprentices, and deep in the South, this would mostly be enslaved people, were working on the front and the back page, the printer is selecting stories and receiving the news. There are no reporters. There's no journalists at this time. There are receivers of news to work in the middle 2 pages. And so these are the middle 2 pages. This is the inside of this particular issue. Again, right? All text, no pictures, no headlines, no nothing, right? The green is some of the text of the Declaration of Independence, right? Ooh, right? So kind of a big deal, but it just looks like it's in the middle of the text like everything else. Now, there are a few ways to get news if you're a printer. One of the reasons why it is on the eastern seaboard is that's where the nodes of the mail might come in, especially New York City, Philadelphia. The weekly packet boat from England goes to New York, and then the mail gets distributed. So sometimes you have some of these printers who are the smarter than others who become postmasters in the city, and so they get everybody's mail, and they open some things, and they get some stuff. Or the guy who, with my skein of maps, the Pennsylvania Journal guy, he also operates a tavern. Ha ha, smart too. So so the ship captains come in, or the sailors get off the ship, and they like, I'll tell you about this, what I saw on the ocean, as long as you buy me a beer. So that also is one of the ways to receive news. So you get news information about this ship just docked, and this is what this person saw. This is how they find out about that there are 10,000 Hessians coming. Is because a guy gets off the boat and goes across the wharf and goes, give me a beer and I'll tell you about the fleet that I saw on its way to New York City to invade New York City in 1776. And that news then becomes a thing. So that's one of the ways, is to sort of get news from a ship captain or get news from the mailbag. But the most reliable news comes, and you see it here, from other newspapers. They're referred to as the exchanges. Okay, and it works in many ways like a newswire would today: AP, UPI, Reuters, et cetera, right? So you see this is Philadelphia. This is a Williamsburg newspaper, but you see it says Philadelphia, this says Annapolis, this says Williamsburg. Okay, I think this one up here it's cut off is New York. So this comes from a Philadelphia newspaper. This comes from the Maryland Gazette in Annapolis. And this is the only bit of local news in this week's newspaper. 1, 2, 3 columns, right? You have some more advertisements filling up the page here. This is it. But that's really interesting, how this could work. We're talking about glue here. The exchanges might provide an antidote. And in the year or so, so I started reading these things in microfilm. Of course, they invented a database that was searchable long after I had finished this, of course. So I read all these things on microfilm, making myself blinder and blinder. And I would do it over the course of many, many months of sitting in front of a microfilm reader. But what I got that the kiddos today who might not get is I developed what I thought was a superpower. Now, as historians go, this is the lamest, or this is a historian's superpower, which of course would be the lamest and most boring of superpowers, not like flight or invisibility or something. But I realized that I was able to predict what was going to happen in something I hadn't seen before. As I was going and turning the squeaky little wheel on the microfilm reader, so we got to, say, August of 1777. I would say, as we got to the middle pages, I bet it's going to be something about this, or something about that, or something about this. It's going to be one of those 3 things. Probably going to be one of these 2 stories, and it's going to be the same language and the same text as I've already read before. Oh, that's interesting. That's kind of glue. How is this working to overcome those difficulties? Are these exchange stories. People are learning about and reading about the same stories in the same text, in the same exact phrases that other people and other places are reading about. So in Williamsburg, they get the same text from Annapolis, and they get the same thing from Philadelphia here. And oftentimes, they're sponsored by Congress, or they are anonymously done by members of, so you also sometimes see letters being published that says, from a friend in this city, from a friend in Philadelphia to a friend in this city, and we know that, oh, that's actually John Adams talking to somebody else. Oh. It's anonymous. We don't know that that's John Adams, that they didn't at the time, but we've been able to piece this together. So you see the revolutionary leadership investing time, which they don't have a lot of, and money, which they definitely don't have a lot of, into these exchanges because they realize how desperate the problem of glue is, and this could be a potential bonding factor. So I developed my little superpower here because I thought this might be a thing. Now, this is young John Adams. Now, I love this one too because he's kind of giving you this side eye, right? See it? He's sort of like, ha, I know something you don't know, right? Not 80-year-old John Adams, but listen, right? In his diary in 1769, he and his cousin Sam and another Boston patriot leader, James Otis, go to the print shop of the Boston Gazette, John Gill and Benjamin Eads, and they start working on the next week's together. Sam Adams, John Adams, James Otis, and the two printers start putting things together. And this is what Adams writes in his diary about that project. The evening was spent in preparing for the next day's newspaper, a curious employment, cooking up paragraphs, articles, occurrences, working the political engine. Uh-oh. Fake news. Kinda. When you look at, so again, because Adams knows that this miracle can't just be left to anybody, this is the work they have to put in because they know that the problems, it's or die, not join. So side-eye John Adams here knows something. And this is not going to just happen organically or miraculously, but the miracle needs to be worked. Work the political engine, cooking up paragraphs. And if you look at the next day's Boston Gazette, there's some stuff in there that may be true and some stuff in there that might not be true. But if you were, it would be very difficult for you as even a discerning reader to know what was fiction and what was not, which is distressing, right? It's germane to the moment that we're living in, I think, right? Germane to the moment that we're living in, right? The Supreme Court is thinking about these things today. We've been talking about this stuff for 7 or 8 years now. So, I hesitate to give credence after Donald Trump was elected and fake news became a thing. I had an op-ed in the Washington Post about Franklin and fake news and him creating stuff. And I had pause about that. Because it did happen in the revolution. Not a lot, but some. There's some working on the political engine. There's direct sort of really fabricating stuff, and for that you want to turn to the pages of Benjamin Franklin. He was a master fabricator, really, really masterful. But there are some of these guys who are working the political engine. But I also don't want to give credence to that and give cover to it, because oftentimes if we say, well, the founders did it, then it's okay. Right? But it is important to understand that this is how politics or a movement has to happen. It is not just miraculous or organic, but it actually takes a lot of work and a lot of management. And that's what Adams knows, and these guys know better, I think. The Loyalists just think that their definition of liberty or following the law or belonging to this British Empire should stand, right? They're good teachers. Go be good students. And the patriot leadership is I don't want to say wiser than that. That's not the word I really want. It's they are more astute on how to manipulate people a little bit on the edges to make sure that their definition of liberty is the one that will carry the day. So we have real problems all sorts of cross-cutting pressures, and potential glue. So how do we get to here? Well, now, I told you, because I've bragged about this a lot now, that I read every single newspaper. And I knew what was coming. And what I was astounded by was how much reference, when the revolution, the shooting starts, stories about the role that Native peoples and African Americans were going to play in the coming conflict. I was astounded about that. Now, the 13 Clocks is about 175 pages long, which is a the Common Cause, which it was drawn from, is 760 pages long. Right. My mother went to like the wrist braces very early when she tried to read this stupid brick of a book. One of the reasons why it's 750 pages long is because of how much stuff I found that I wanted to convey. Because I was back I put together a Word document just from 1776 that listed quotations from the major founding fathers: Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, Lawrence, all the delegates to the Congress. Anytime they mentioned the role that either African Americans or Native peoples or German mercenaries might play in the Revolution, I put that all together in one document in a chronological order. That thing, single-spaced, went to more than 1,000 pages long. My old cheap graduate student laptop could barely handle it. I would open that document and I'd go get like breakfast while it loaded, because if I touched it, it would all crash to the ground. I was astounded. That's why I wanted Common Cause to be that long, to convey that kind of thing, because I was astounded. So I'm going to tell you a few of those stories and what they might do now. Now, part of it is about how do we think about the two kind of separate things about the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. Those seem like those are two separate things. Now, historians, when I was in school and maybe when you were in school, would talk about the American Revolution as thinking about the ideals of liberty and consent and representation and the ideological stuff that goes along with that as separate from, and then you might do a day on the war. And those are two different things, right? And that idea that the war was just kind of a side or something that happened, it's sort of like when we think about World War II and the Holocaust, right? Well, there's World War II, and then we do the Holocaust for a day, right? As if those two things are not entirely bound up and mutually constitutive of one another. Those things are not inseparable. I think the Revolutionary War and the Revolution are not inseparable. But the reason we think that way is, again, John Adams. What do we mean by the Revolution? The war? No. It was no part of the Revolution. It was only an effect and a consequence of it. The Revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was affected from 1760 to 1775. Now, John Adams writes that when he's this old, but he's doing this to you. Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah, J.A.? Now, that sentiment, I don't know if any of you have ever read The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. It's now 55 years old. It came out in 1967, and it won the Bancroft Prize, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. And it was, Daniel Ellsberg carried it in his backpack when he was influenced to steal the documents that became the Pentagon Papers, because he felt like he was being a good American patriot like these guys. He was very affected by what Balin said, and this is sort of the Bible of the ideological school of how we think about the revolution. And not only in chapter 1, but also in chapter 5, he leads those two chapters with that sentiment. The war doesn't matter. The war, right? Adams writes that to Jefferson in 1815, and he says almost the exact same thing in his second practicing in 1818 to Niles, right? So we've been taught for a generation or more, two really, and historians have battled about this a lot. I can get really super boring about that, but that becomes our one of the most important interpretations of the revolution, is that the revolution is not the war itself. I disagree. When the shooting starts in April of 1775, everything changes. All of the stakes go far up about the potential of the colonies to have to work together. The stakes go way, way up. Now you have to convince people not only to stop buying tea, but to potentially get their head blown off with a cannonball, right? Or lose a father or a brother, have your household suffer. The tremendous stakes of war are very, very different than that. So, of course, what you might expect is we start to see a change happening in the argumentation about why we're doing this. So when I started reading these newspapers, as the war started, what I didn't see was talk about taxation or consent or representation or any of that stuff, or liberty, really. What I saw was story after story after story with my superpower, my story after story after story about British agents working with people of color. That was what was over and over. That's part of that 1,000 pages. That's what I saw over and over and over again through those exchanges. Things like this, right? These are stories that you would see in the newspapers now after the revolution started. Canadian Governor Guy Carleton and British Indian Superintendent Guy Johnson met with natives 1,500 miles back of Quebec. That's pretty far, right? For a Virginians, we didn't need to know that in these tiny little columns of print. This is something they have to know about, 1,500 miles back of Quebec. And the Virginia printer turned it into 15,000 miles. What's that? That's like almost back around again, right? Right? So that story is first in the New Hampshire Gazette, where they might care about it. But then it's published in Pennsylvania, in the Ledger, the Packet. It's in Norfolk. It's in Williamsburg. The next week, a report that Johnson was suspected of endeavoring to stir up the Indians against the colonists. That is in New York Journal. But then it's in Connecticut, Boston, Salem. And then it comes back around again in the New Hampshire Gazette the week before that one. So we're starting to see this bouncing around of stories. And this idea of, and also of corroborating that this is, and it's the same story, that this might be true. We start to see these kinds of things. Here's another one. As a Red Sox fan, I take special umbrage to this one. But the Indians delivered us a speech on the 12th in which they related the substance of all the conferences Colonel Johnson had with them last summer, where he delivered to each of the Canadian tribes a war belt and a hatchet, and after which they were invited to feast on a Bostonian and drink his blood. Oof. Now we have full proof that the ministerial servants have attempted to engage the savages against us. That's in the Pennsylvania Post, Pennsylvania Evening Post, in Christmas Eve. And then in the Philadelphia papers, 3 more there, but also 3 in New York City. Then it's in Annapolis, Baltimore, Norwich, 3 in Boston, Williamsburg, New London, Connecticut, and Providence, Rhode Island. Same exact words. Now, why those? Because the Continental Congress ordered that story to be published. They said, they don't do that very often, but when they have a really juicy thing, they give orders, put this in your newspaper. Not everybody did. Not everybody followed those orders. That's not all of them. But that's what also happened. And so these are just 2 sort of very small, but I have a lot of examples of this kind of thing, about these particular kinds of stories, because they have really important messages to convey about who the British are, that connects to some of their deeper-seated prejudices about native peoples, that now they can merge them together. And you also see here, too, you also have this kind of glimmer of good Indians who are not falling for it, right? They gave us, the reason we know this is because they turned this information over to us, right? So they're not falling for it entirely. So there's this glimmer of perhaps some people who are not falling for the really deceitful stuff that the British are trying to do. Then we have this guy, Lord Dunmore, William Murray, the governor of Virginia, who wants to stop the rebellion at as little cost as possible. Makes sense. And he issues in November of 1775 a very similar version to what Lincoln is going to do in 1863, an Emancipation Proclamation. It's limited, he thinks, in scope, but turns out to be much broader in practice. The Dunmore's Proclamation of November 1775 is another one of these things that he thinks is going to work for him that turns out to backfire, becomes a bigger story for the Patriots to then seize upon as these are the evil things that the British might do to us. All right. And then then that turns into things like this. So this happens a few weeks after Dunmore's Proclamation. You see this kind of newspaper. It first appears in the Williamsburg Gazette, but then Baltimore, Annapolis, Philadelphia, New York City twice, all over the place. Look at this story. Remember, we're talking about like 3 columns worth of news. That's all there is. There aren't sections and sections and sections of this stuff, right? So printers have to be very pointed and careful with the kind of things that they select for the exchanges. Look at this story. What is this? Right? It's a sheep raid that actually doesn't work. So now this is big. This is a big deal for Mr. Narsworthy, right, on the Isle of Wight. But why do people need to know this in Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York City and all over Connecticut? Why do they need to know? Well, there are significant themes and images here that people that need to know about, right? Partly because you have black people dressed in the British uniform of the 14th Regiment. Oh, that's disturbing. They refer to them as the governor's men. But you also see, again, in the same kind of way, you have what would be called a faithful slave in the 19th century. You have someone who is alerting Mr. Narsworthy that this danger is here, and he's the reason that it doesn't come off, that he saves Narsworthy from this loss, drove them without taking any stock. So you have black people in uniform fighting over the revolution here. And so why would this rather silly thing need to take up space and all over the place? There are a number of reasons for that. John Stewart, not that John Stewart, John Stewart is the British superintendent for the South. There's the 2 lead British officials that are in charge of native affairs. There's one Guy Johnson in the north and John Stewart in the south. And John Stewart has fled to Florida, and his house has been raided and sacked, and his wife has been sort of attacked by Patriot authorities in South Carolina because they thought that he had papers, and he did, about him also trying to raise Cherokee and Creek native peoples in the South to rise up against the Patriot cause. And he says this: the newspapers were full of publications calculated to excite the fears of the people. Massacres and instigated insurrections were in the mouth of every child. Right? Let me go back to that one. I thought that I had something else here. Right, sorry. Calculated, if we were to change that to working the political engine, same kind of thing. Mouths of every child. That this is what people are talking about. They're not talking about liberty. They're not talking about representation or consent. They're talking about this in 1775. And this is not an accident. How sunk is Britain? Could not Britons venture to wage war with America until they were told that Americans were cowards? Not even then without the assistance of Roman Catholics and Indians in endeavoring to raise amongst us a domestic enemy? Whoever has heard of Carleton's and Dunmore's plots against us cannot but allow that they might have been authorized by a higher power. Most freely would I cut the Gordian knot. Now, this is the same month that Common Sense is going to come out. This also, this is a sort of small little sort of editorial that first appears in Williamsburg, and then Philadelphia, New York twice, Hartford, Boston, Providence, Norwich, Connecticut. Here's another one. This is a few weeks before the Declaration of Independence. The King of England delights in blood, yea, thirsteth for the blood of Americans, Hessians, Hanoverians, Brunswickers, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, regulars, and Tories are invited to the carnage. This is no fiction, but an awful reality, not the production of delirium, but a substantial matter of fact, says Armitage in the Connecticut Courant, as Jefferson's writing the Declaration. And then it appears not in Virginia, or Philadelphia, but Massachusetts, Maryland, and New York. So you're seeing a movement here about the develop, or it's starting to not only become fact, but also part of opinion about why we should have these things happen. That we are divorced, to me, is very clear. The only question is concerning the proper time for making an explicit declaration in words. Some people might have to look around them and before, behind, on the right hand, and the left, and think, this is the time to resolve. But remember, you can't make 13 clocks strike precisely alike at that same second. That's what he says on the 22nd of June, 1776. But he's been trying. Still has doubts about it, but he's been trying. So that we get to here. Okay. All right. We get to here. Oh my gosh, I'm out of time. Okay. All right. Crap. Okay. This is the important stuff. All right. So yeah. Okay. No one knows what this is because no one sees this at the time, but we have it here. Right. So you see here, you see these 27 articles of reasons why the Declaration is why we have to declare independence, and they build in drama, and they build in severity. Right? If you look at them, the first few ones are kind of rather silly, but we get to the end. I don't have time. Okay, so what's the last one? What's the deal breaker? The very last one. He has incited domestic insurrections and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an indistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That's the deal breaker. That's the very last one. Now, it wasn't supposed to, well, it sort of wasn't supposed to be, but Congress works on this stuff for a very long time. This is the, give me 2 more minutes and I'll be done with this. This is the rough draft, Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration. And you see at the beginning here, there's very little editing, right? It's pretty much as is. It's 97% Jefferson. These are the beginning ones. This is the end. This is where they spent the most time on the 2nd and 3rd of July working on getting this text right. And I don't have time anymore, but if you go home and look up what Jefferson writes about slavery, this is the great object of desire. I mean, Jefferson. But I'm going to take a minute because it's really important stuff. Look at how he writes about slavery here. He talks about this piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, to keep open a market where men, Jefferson is capitalizing like our kids do with texting. When he wants to yell, he capitalizes in the rough draft. Men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit and restrain this execrable commerce. He's referring to slavery. This is the great object of desire. Gone. At the end, and then he says, and that this assemblage of whores might want no feet of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms amongst us. That's Dunmore's proclamation. Great object of desire, gone. Dunmore, in. Because they include it here. They cut all this out, but they include one line of it. This is Dunmore. That's the 27th one. It could have been this. If we think about the abolitionists in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, as they used this document to try to prove their case that slavery is wrong, think about if that language was in here. Assemblage of horrors, execrable commerce, piratical warfare. He's describing how slavery is but the needs of the glue, the needs of the Union overcome everything else. And so that can't be in here anymore. Okay. Rats, I don't have time. Okay. Here's how this matters so much. I'm just about done. Yes, the revolutionaries made tremendous changes to a lot of things. They got rid of aristocracy. They got rid of established churches. They relied on written constitutions in new and important ways. They also threw away the concept of monarchical subjecthood. They said no subjects, no dukes, no lords, no earls, no kings, right? But they didn't really know what they were doing when they said that. So citizenship was not really defined. If you went back in time and asked everybody, what does a citizen mean, they would give you all sorts of different answers. But citizenship is a club, and the members decide. We decide who's in and who's out. No one tells us this. The king doesn't decide who's in and who's out. We decide, right? That's what citizenship really is all about. That's the we of we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's we. It's not them, or we the people, right? And that's where this stuff really comes in and is important. Because these are the founding stories that I found. And I've given you just a small little glimpse of a lot of them that are in there. Because those stories were about African Americans and indigenous people supporting the crown. Even though there were some a little bit of counter pressures about good native peoples or good African Americans helping the patriots, those are entirely drowned out by those helping the king. And I think those founding stories merged these terrifying colonial nightmares of slave insurrections and Indian massacres with nation-making and Republican citizenship and brought these things together. I'm not saying that this creates race in any way. I'm saying it really sort of solidifies it as a core of part of who the United States is. And that's the side-eyeing that Adams is doing. That's the glue in many ways. That's at least part of the ingredients of the glue, is this idea that we are not, that we hold these truths to be self-evident does not include those people who helped the king, and that's what sort of brings all these things together. Oh, I think I'm done. Okay. Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah. There you go. Okay. All right. That's the end. Sorry, I didn't mean to go that far. Long. Sorry.
All right, we have some time for questions, and
We do, right?
yes, we do. We have a lot. We're fine.
Okay.
I'm sure you could talk about this for a long time, but if you raise your
I
hand,
definitely can.
we'll run a mic. We got Patrick, Hilber, man in this aisle, and I'll be over here. So I saw some pop up over here, so we'll start.
So, so John Adams wrote a lot of stuff that would inspire the thoughts of the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But as we know, people don't always tell the motivations behind their thinking and their thoughts and their words. What do you think John Adams really wanted for John Adams in all of this?
Oh, he wanted to be known as the miracle worker, right? That's why he's hiding in 1815, 1818. He's hiding. Why he's also saying, pay no attention to the war. Because he's going to do things, he's going to say things and advocate for things. For example, John Adams hates slavery. But in 1775, he gets a pamphlet written by a Virginian, says, if you really want liberty to be true, you got to end slavery now. And Adams not only shelves it in his desk, literally shelves it in his desk, but he says no one can know that this is what people think, because the war has put this kind of different pressure on him. Now, he wants us to forget that. Once the crisis is over, and this thing that they never thought would be established. Remember, this kind of rebellion's never happened before. So they have no idea what's going to happen. And so I think that trumps the principles. After the fact, I think he and Jefferson, too, want to be associated with liberty in particular ways. But we need to go back to the moment and not believe them in a lot of ways about what they're going to tell us they did after the fact. Of course, we all do that, right? We all paper over some of the things we did in our youth and make it different than it actually went down. But it's the job of the historian to try to, I think, reconstruct the motivations of what you did as a youth and what consequences it might have. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Oh, yeah, this is the war had nothing to do with it. Adams is being a little side-eye about that. Yes, it did. You know it did.
I wonder what you would say about the, right here. Thank you. Thank you for a good presentation, about the economic side of connections of the East India Company as a corporate monopoly and small trader, business people, well, smugglers for that matter, manufacturers uniting as a way of trying to break power from economic control from London.
I'm not sure I'm following your
Well,
question.
the idea is that the British gave such tax breaks, such monopolistic powers to the major corporations in Britain, particularly the East India Company, which was in economic trouble, that they squashed, and that small people in America saw uniting as a way of developing their own economic power.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's certainly what the British think the real motivation is. They think, and will continue to think for years that what Washington's really doing is trying to skate on his debts, right? That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to not ever pay his visa bill. And that becomes a huge fight at the Treaty of Paris. Like what you had before this still counts. And that's a motivation of the East India Company, which is where the tea comes from that goes into Boston Harbor, is a sort of an important part of the British mercantilist system that the Americans don't like, and they really want to establish their own kind of freedom from that. But I think it's overplayed when we talk about the specter that is as a motivating factor for bringing these guys together. I don't see a lot of that kind of, we're all going to be turned into a virtual servants of the East India Company. That didn't play as well. But they are trying these kinds of different arguments, and they do see what plays. And to my mind, what does play are these sort of tapping into these ideas about race. I think they open the toolbox up, and the tool at the very top of the toolbox are these colonial nightmares about slave insurrections and Indian massacres. And it overcomes those internal problems, overcomes the religion. We're not talking about religion, right? We're talking about these things that we all are afraid of together, right? And I think it's a cohesive thing. I meant to say that earlier.
So to the extent that the exchanges were so important for disseminating the pieces, when you started to talk early on about the printers, I wondered what their sort of motivations were of being printers, of putting it out there, and so then the relationship of the exchanges.
Yeah. No, a number of the printers are between medium and highly invested in the patriot cause, right? They are Eads and Giller's Sons of Liberty. A number of them in Philadelphia are not just they're not just bystanders. They are deeply invested in this. What happens in the 1770s is the middle ground evaporates. You either, by the time, and it really escalates once the shooting starts, you're either a patriot newspaper or a loyalist newspaper. And the middle ground evaporates, which is sort of there in the 1770s. And so printers are becoming more and more cognizant that they need to say a specific thing if they want to hold on to readers. Printing a newspaper is a terrible business idea in the 1770s. There's a long tradition of never paying your bill. So they take out, the subscription happens once a year, and so you'll have a lot of printers saying, hey, I like to eat too, so could you pay your bills, please? That's a long tradition of gentlemen never paying their bills, especially newspapers. And so they know that their margins are razor thin, and so that's also part of the political. They have to get the politics really right on this. One of the reasons I think that everything starts to go really haywire at the end of the revolution, where the motivation starts to collapse, and you see like real civil war in the South, is because a patriot newspaper like these is not printed anywhere south of Richmond. Only ones in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia in 1779, 80, 81, 82, 83 are loyalist newspapers, and are entirely subsidized by the British Army. And so they're only getting that side of the story. So I think that, I can't prove it. I'd love to be able to prove it, but I think that contributes to the growing, the messiness of what happens. In 1774, 5, 6, patriots have almost an entire monopoly, except for a couple of papers in New York City, over this discourse. So that's a great question about how involved the patriot newspapers are. They're becoming more and more politicized and more invested for financial reasons and also their own political reasons.
Up here. Thank you. My family comes from a generation of Scots-Irish who left Northern Ireland.
A hand for the Scots-Irish, okay.
And I had read in some history books that British soldiers wrote that they weren't really fighting the colonials, they were actually fighting the Scotch-Irish in
Yes.
America.
Yeah, yeah.
To what extent do you believe that the immigrants from the British islands constituted a major part of the colonial revolution?
So the first thing that comes to mind is another big book, but it's a book called Kevin Phillips wrote called The Cousins Wars. That's about this particular thing where what we see starting in the 15th century in Ireland. This is what the revolution really is played out as this long standing kind of fight between England and Greater Britain that just sort of comes across the Atlantic Ocean. The Scots-Irish are a interesting question, partly because literacy is not as strong with them. So does my thesis work with them? As much. And what other motivations could there be? I'm not suggesting that this is the reason people picked up guns and put themselves in harm's way. I think if you went back and asked every person why you're doing this, why are you in the Continental Army, they would give you 75,000 different reasons why that is. But I think that what I look at is these are the stories that they spent their time and money and what they thought people should be doing and why they should be giving money and investing in this. Well, Scots-Irish are going to have their own motivations for this. They're going to have their own ways of thinking, of nursing different problems from home, thinking about what this might mean for their own households, right, in their own communities. So I don't know.
Okay. Well, how does all of this information from you and all your research play into the 1619 project?
Well, like I said, I'm a supporter in principle, for sure. I do think that we are that the centrality, again, that 1,000-page document. George Washington was thinking about people of color all the time in 1776. I'll give you an example. So it's Christmas Eve, 1776. You know what happens the next day, right? What did George Washington do the next morning? Crosses the Delaware, right? Biggest day of his life. Trenton, right? Biggest day of his life. The revolution hangs in the balance. If he screws it up, it's over. For 3 weeks, he's been doing nothing but planning for this to hopefully come off the way he wants it to be done. Okay? This is a long-winded way of getting to answer your question. The night before, that night, it's the same night that Eisenhower's writing the Great Crusade letter for D-Day, when everything hangs in the balance, right? And he's like, I hope this is going to work. Washington's doing that. That night, he writes a letter to the Passamaquoddy and St. Croix Indians who live on the Maine frontier to tell them, hey, don't listen to what the British are doing. Stay either neutral or join our side. Why would that be crossing his mind that night of nights? That tells you something about how that's not actually an intrusive or foreign thought to him, but he does that stuff over and over and over again. And even on that night, he is thinking about what role Native peoples might play as he's putting together. I mean, if you read, so the papers of George Washington have every letter Washington's written in order, either written he writes or he receives. And for like 225 pages, it's all preparations for Trenton. And the night before, it's that letter from to the Passamaquoddy and St. Croix Indians, right? And I just find that to be such an amazing thing. So to me, the idea that we should center these kinds of stories or the center race at the heart of this, I entirely agree with. We can go overboard on that. And we also need to be very, very true to what as much as we can be, to explaining how complicated that was, right? So I agree with the principles of the 1619 Project. I just think that it's very complicated. And there were a lot of people who wanted to get rid of slavery as much as they wanted to protect it. And we should talk about that. They are talking about slavery. That is the conversation. But they are disagreeing about that. But I think the thrust of the 1619 Project is to say that this was the most important thing they were thinking about. I agree with that in principle. That's what I have found.
Probably have time for one more here. Thank you, and we've really appreciated this today. You had a slide up with John Adams, 1769,
Yeah.
preparing the news
Yes.
for publication.
Yeah.
Back in the day, for some of us who have the white showing, our history showed that one of the main triggers for 1775 was the Boston Massacre of 1770, which only happened about 6 months after that slide was dated that you showed.
Yes.
How, as we've grown older and we're a little more suspicious of what we see and hear every day, what would be your thoughts about the actuality of the Boston Massacre and the engineering of news and the repercussions 5 years later with Lexington and Concord?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, that what they are talking about in that next day's newspaper, a lot of it is about the occupation, right? And the roughness of the occupation, that the British troops who have been there for about 3 or 4 months by September of 1769, and how the Bostonians are really upset about it. And now, how do I answer this question without doing more John Adams bashing? Let's see. All right. So, do you know what John Adams does in the trial for the British soldiers of the Boston Massacre? He defends them, right? He defends them. Why does he defend them? What's that? No, he wasn't. He took the case. He volunteered to. What? Rule of law, exactly, right? He wanted to say that this rebellion wasn't, that this crisis, that what the patriots are resisting has principles to it, right? So therefore, I'm going to defend the soldiers who did this terrible thing. I don't agree with them, but they deserve their day in court, right? The officer, Preston, and his men. But yet, in his closing argument, who does Adams actually blame for what happens at the massacre? Crispus Attucks. He blames Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks, who is half black, half Native Indian, and he says it's that kind of rabble that were, and he's very specific about this. Eric Hinderaker has a wonderful book on the Boston Massacre, about the city of Boston and the massacre itself. That talks about his particular, again, he reaches for race. Benjamin Franklin, whenever he feels like, Franklin, who's about to become a negotiator for the Treaty of Paris, is concerned that the Americans are going to go soft on the British, and he wants them to remember these ugly, ugly days early on. Franklin almost always goes back to these arguments in 1781, 82, 83. He publishes things about it. He writes about, he wants the American people to remember what the British did here and why this happened in the first place. So these guys, in many ways, again, it's hard for me not to do some John Adams bashing here, but when they want to reach for something to really nail the argument, they almost always reach for race. Yeah.
All right, that's a sobering
place to end.
Yeah, I'm not happy about it.
Food for thought. But please check out, we have some copies of 13 Clocks in the bookstore. Dr. Parkinson will be up there. Please let him get up there and don't trap him down here so that everyone has an opportunity to say hello, have a book signed if they want. And also, if you want that deeper dive, check out The Common Cause if you're a real voracious reader. Otherwise...
Get the braces for the wrists.
Thank you for coming. We have one more history forum in April with Adam Sowards on the history of our public lands and all of the complicated mess that has been and the ways that it really reveals a lot about our conflicts, our values, and all of those things. So once again, round of applause for our speaker.